On June 18, 1815, one of the most significant battles in world history unfolded on a muddy field near the Belgian town of Waterloo. The battle would seal the fate of Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of the French, and determine the future of Europe for decades to come. The Battle of Waterloo wasn't just a military engagement. It was the climax of nearly 2 decades of war that had reshaped the continent. The battle itself was a high-stakes contest between old empires and emerging powers, where the forces of Napoleon, who had once dominated Europe, faced off against a coalition of European monarchies bent on ending his reign. Napoleon's military genius, charisma, and ambition had allowed him to build an empire stretching from Spain to Russia. But by 1815, the tide had turned. After being exiled to the island of Elba following his first abdication in 1814, Napoleon made a daring return to France, assembling an army once again and setting the stage for a final showdown that would determine the fate of his empire. Napoleon's return to power, however, sparked alarm throughout Europe. The continent's major powers, Great Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, formed a coalition determined to stop him once and for all. At the heart of this climactic battle stood 2 generals, Napoleon Bonaparte and the Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wellesley, who led the British and Allied forces. Opposing them was Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher, the leader of the Prussian forces. These men, each brilliant in their own right, would command the forces that decided Europe's future. As we examine the Battle of Waterloo in detail, we'll uncover the strategies, the players, and the forces that came together to deliver one of the most decisive military engagements in history. The Battle of Waterloo was not an isolated event. It was the result of a series of political and military decisions that stretched back over many years. In 1814, after a long series of defeats, Napoleon was forced to abdicate the throne. His empire collapsed, and he was exiled to the Mediterranean island of Elba. But Napoleon was far from finished. In February 1815, he escaped from Elba and returned to France, where he quickly regained the loyalty of his army and the French people. The Bourbon monarchy, which had been restored to power after Napoleon's abdication, was weak and unpopular. The French Revolution's ideals were still alive, and many saw Napoleon as the symbol of French power and glory. Napoleon's return sent shockwaves across Europe. The great powers that had defeated him in 1814, including Britain, Austria, Russia, and Prussia, quickly formed the Seventh Coalition. They were determined to eliminate the threat posed by the French emperor once and for all. The stage was set for the final confrontation. Napoleon, realizing that time was of the essence, made the decision to strike first. He had an army of around 73,000 men at his disposal, and he planned to defeat the British and Prussian forces before they could unite. His strategy was to split the 2 armies and destroy them separately, thus preventing the coalition from coordinating a unified defense. Napoleon's forces at Waterloo were divided into 4 main corps. The French right wing was commanded by the experienced Marshal Michel Ney, while the left wing was under the leadership of the capable Marshal Emmanuel de Grouchy. Napoleon himself took command of the center, with his Imperial Guard as a powerful reserve force. Opposing Napoleon's army was the Duke of Wellington's Anglo-Allied army. Wellington's forces were a mix of British, Dutch, Belgian, and German troops, numbering around 68,000 soldiers. The Duke of Wellington was a seasoned commander who had gained fame for his victories in Spain during the Peninsular War. His army was well-trained and battle-hardened, but it was also smaller than Napoleon's and had to contend with a potentially lethal problem. The Prussian army under Blücher, which was marching toward the battlefield to join forces with Wellington. Blücher's Prussian forces numbered about 50,000 soldiers. Blücher himself was a determined and aggressive commander, whose troops had been a thorn in Napoleon's side in previous campaigns. The Prussians, however, were positioned several miles away from Wellington's army when the battle began, and there was significant risk that Blücher's forces would arrive too late to make a difference. The terrain at Waterloo was also an important factor. The battlefield was a mix of soft, wet ground, particularly in the area known as La Haye-Sainte, and higher ground that offered a strategic advantage. The battlefield was also divided by a number of key landmarks, such as the farmhouse of Hougoumont and the village of Plancenoit, which would play significant roles in the battle's outcome. The Battle of Waterloo began early in the morning on June 18, 1815, with Napoleon hoping to deliver a swift blow to the Anglo-Allied forces before the Prussians could arrive. The day started with light rain, making the battlefield muddy and difficult to maneuver. Napoleon's first objective was to capture the key position of Hougoumont, a walled farm complex on his right flank. He hoped that by capturing it, he would force Wellington's forces to reposition, thereby gaining the initiative. Marshal Ney's forces launched several attacks on Hougoumont, but the defenders, composed mostly of British and Belgian troops, held firm. The French assaults were repulsed, but the fighting there drained valuable resources and manpower from the French. Meanwhile, the main action took place in the center of the battlefield, where Napoleon launched a series of attacks against Wellington's position. The British held a defensive line along the ridge of Mont Saint-Jean, with Wellington deploying his forces in a strong defensive position. Despite several heavy French assaults, Wellington's troops managed to hold their ground, repelling attack after attack. Napoleon's strategy relied on breaking through the British center and creating a gap in the line. But Wellington's troops, under his calm and decisive leadership, remained resilient. Throughout the morning and early afternoon, the French made little headway. As the battle progressed, Wellington was facing mounting pressure from the French. By mid-afternoon, it seemed that the Anglo-Allied forces might be on the brink of collapse. But in a turn of fate, the Prussian army, under the command of Gebhard Lebrecht von Blücher, began to arrive on the battlefield. The Prussians attacked the French right flank at Plancenoit, forcing Napoleon to divert his forces to meet this new threat. Blücher's timely arrival was a game-changer. Napoleon had anticipated that the Prussian forces would be too far away to intervene, but Blücher's march had been faster than expected. As the Prussians struck the French flank, they sowed confusion in Napoleon's ranks. This disruption gave Wellington the opportunity to counterattack. With the Prussians now engaging the French on one side and Wellington's forces holding firm on the other, Napoleon's position became increasingly untenable. In a last-ditch effort to break the British line, Napoleon committed his Imperial Guard, the elite troops that had been saved for a decisive moment. However, by this time, the French morale was beginning to waver. The Guard's assault, while initially successful, was repulsed by the determined British and Dutch forces. The sight of the Imperial Guard retreating was a devastating blow to French morale. As the Prussian forces pressed harder on the French right and with the British holding strong in the center, Napoleon's army began to disintegrate. The French forces were now caught in a pincer movement, and the retreat turned into a rout. Napoleon had lost control of the battlefield, and by late afternoon, the battle was effectively over. The Battle of Waterloo marked the end of Napoleon Bonaparte's rule. He was forced to abdicate once again, and this time there would be no escape. Napoleon was exiled to the island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, where he would spend the remaining years of his life in isolation. For Europe, the defeat at Waterloo brought an end to the Napoleonic Wars, which had ravaged the continent for more than a decade. The battle also marked the beginning of a new era in European politics. The Congress of Vienna, which had been meeting during the final stages of the war, finalized its plans for a new balance of power in Europe. The Bourbon monarchy was restored in France, and the major European powers sought to prevent any future rise of a figure like Napoleon. For the next century, Europe would remain largely at peace, with the balance of power maintained through a system of alliances and diplomatic treaties. The Battle of Waterloo was not just the final confrontation between two armies. It was a clash of empires, of ideologies and of destinies. Napoleon, the emperor who had once conquered much of Europe, was defeated by a coalition of monarchs determined to stop him from reshaping the continent. The battle highlighted the importance of timing, strategy, and leadership, and it changed the course of history. Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo is remembered as a pivotal moment in European history. It marked the end of an era dominated by Napoleonic warfare and the rise of a more stable, though not without its own conflicts, European order. For the nations that had fought against him, the victory was seen as a triumph of collective action, while for Napoleon, it was the tragic end of an ambition that had once seemed unstoppable. In the end, Waterloo remains a symbol of the fragility of empire and the inevitability of change. It was a battle that decided not just the fate of one man, but the future of an entire continent.